Emily, darling, bring out the 82 law fight. Richard's voice floated from the dining room, hard and commanding, brooking no argument. I was standing in front of the marble countertop in the kitchen, a silver spoon in my hand, carefully adjusting the angle of the foie gras on the plate. This stuff was ridiculously expensive, a tiny bite enough for the maid Anna to work half a month for, but in Richard's eyes, it was probably no different from peanut butter from the supermarket. Coming right up, I called out, my voice sickeningly sweet, giving even myself goosebumps. I really admire myself, playing the virtuous wife for 3 years. The Oscars were blind not to give me an award. My fingers unconsciously caressed the 3-carat diamond ring on the ring finger of my left hand. It felt uncomfortably large. The other day, while tidying Richard's study, I found a velvet box in the innermost part of his drawer, with an identical ring lying inside, only with a higher clarity than the one on my hand. Next to it was a shopping receipt, dated last month's Valentine's Day, with the recipient written as Amber. Even buying jewelry for his mistress is so perfunctory. Couldn't he have chosen a different style? Chef Jacques coughed lightly beside me, his snow-white chef's uniform starched and crisp, as meticulous as the man himself. Madam, the temperature of the truffle soup. Lower it another 5 degrees, I said without looking up, my eyes still fixed on the plate of foie gras. Mr. Prentice doesn't have good teeth and doesn't like it too hot. Actually, I was holding a grudge. Last week, this old man told Richard at the banquet that I looked like a vase and probably couldn't even understand double-entry bookkeeping. The corner of my eye caught the surveillance screen on the wall. Richard was bending over to inspect the dining table, running his fingers over the silverware, like a patrolling prison guard. He does this before every dinner party, wishing he could use a magnifying glass to examine every corner, as if his reputation on Wall Street would be ruined if a single hair was out of place. The door to the wine cellar beeped. The combination lock was unlocked. 6-9-2-1, our wedding anniversary. I sneered, the arrogant bastard even has to remind me when setting a password, lest I forget that I'm a Carson now. The cold wine bottle pressed against the inside of my wrist, where the bluish-purple bruises hadn't faded yet. Last night he drank too much and said I was too slow handing him the hangover soup, grabbing my wrist and slamming it against the wall. Now, touching something cold, that pain comes back, like being pricked with needles. Need any help, Mrs. Carson? A timid voice came from the stairwell. The new maid Anna stood there, clutching a rag in her hand, her knuckles white. I glanced at her cuffs, wrinkled like pickles. If Richard saw that, he'd probably send her packing on the spot. This kid is only 19, from Ohio, her eyes still full of longing for New York, a bit like me 3 years ago, just a lot dumber than I was then. No need, I gave her a reassuring smile, shifting the wine bottle in my hand. Go iron the napkins again, remember to use distilled water, Richard doesn't like water stains on them. Watching her scurry away down the hallway, I couldn't help but sigh. 3 years ago, when I first resigned from J.P. Morgan Chase, I was like her, thinking that marrying Richard was a blessing from a past life. A Wall Street rising star, young, rich, and handsome, so many socialites were breaking their heads trying to marry him. Now that I think about it, those socialites who were breaking their heads probably haven't seen him when he's drunk. Laughter came from the dining room. Richard was showing off his newly bought Picasso sketch to the Prentice couple. The frame was more expensive than the painting, hanging on the wall like a moldy rag, only he thought it was a treasure. This is what you call a real investment, he said smugly, shaking the wine glass in his hand, the ice clinking against the glass, much more reliable than the tech stocks some people are always talking about. He glanced at me sideways as he said this. Last week, I told him that Tesla's stock price was going to rise, and he scolded me, what does a woman know? I walked over with the red wine, deliberately tripping on the carpet with my high heels. The wine sloshed violently in the glass, as if it was about to spill, but I steadied my wrist gently, and not a drop spilled. I've been practicing this skill for 3 years. Every time he orders me around in front of outsiders, I do this, and it makes me feel better to see him clenching his fists in secret. Be careful, darling. Richard reached out and supported my waist, his fingers like iron tongs, pinching my ribs hard, hurting so much that I almost cried out. The smell of his cologne hit me in the face, and my stomach churned. It was the style he had Amber pick out for me last year on my birthday. At the time, he pretended and said, darling, I really don't know what you like, so I had my assistant help me choose. Sorry, I lowered my head, deliberately letting my hair fall down to cover my face, revealing just the right amount of shame. Maybe the new shoes don't fit well. Actually, I've worn these high heels 8 times, I know them better than my own fingers. Mrs. Prentice across from me clicked her tongue softly, giving me a meaningful look. Last month in yoga class, she secretly told me while the instructor turned around, "My husband has friends at customs, if you need certain information, feel free to contact me." At the time, she slipped me a piece of paper with just a phone number on it, not even a name. When the main course was served at the dinner party, Richard's phone suddenly rang. The ringtone was as flamboyant as he was, a noisy hip-hop song, probably set by that little minx Amber. He frowned and looked at the screen, his mouth immediately drooped, squeezing out the kind of fake apologetic expression I'd been seeing for 3 years. "Sorry everyone, there's an urgent merger." "Go ahead, darling," I quickly interrupted him with a smile, and even reached out to straighten his tie. "Work is important, don't delay business." The moment he stood up, I clearly saw the name flashing on the screen, Amber. That 22-year-old blonde intern at Richard's company, with breasts as big as basketballs, always dressed like she was barely wearing anything when she came to our parties, and her eyes were always glancing at Richard. Did she think I was blind? As soon as Richard left, I excused myself to go to the kitchen to check on the desserts and slipped into the back kitchen. Jacques was fiddling with the chocolates, and when he saw me come in, he subtly shifted to the side. I pretended to check if the strawberries were fresh, and quickly stuck my hand to the inside of the ventilation duct. The miniature camera was from Mrs. Toplison, small as a fingernail, angled just right to capture the safe in the corner. Richard goes there every Friday night to mess with his stash, and I want to see how much dirty stuff this bastard is hiding. "Madam," Jacques suddenly said, his voice as quiet as a mosquito's hum, "the truffle chocolates you wanted, made according to the special recipe." He glanced at the refrigerator and raised his chin towards the bottom shelf. I nodded, knowing what's up. Hidden there was the sleeping powder I had him specially prepare, brought back from Europe, colorless and odorless, undetectable in chocolate mousse. Just the right amount to put an elephant to sleep for a day and a night, perfect for dealing with scum like Richard. When I returned to the dining room, Mr. Pliston was telling a dirty joke, gesticulating wildly, almost spitting into the plates. I followed along with a fake smile, but my eyes were fixed on the spot where Richard had been sitting. His napkin had a lipstick stain on it, a shiny pink, exactly the same shade Amber wore last time. I only ever use nude shades. Richard said he hated women who wore it like they just sucked blood. Gaudy. "Emily," Richard suddenly raised his voice, startling me, "show Mrs. Pliston your new necklace." The smugness in his tone, like a peacock in the zoo showing off its tail, as if I were some collectible he bought. I rolled my eyes inwardly, but obediently brushed my hair aside, revealing the diamond necklace on my neck. He bought this thing with my birthday gift budget, or rather, with the bonus that should have been mine. Last year, I helped him with a tax avoidance plan that saved him $2 million, and all I got was this broken chain, not as good as the one I used to buy myself. "So beautiful," Mrs. Pliston said with feigned admiration, touching the necklace. Her toe gently touched my calf under the table, especially the cutting. "You can tell it's extraordinary." I returned her a smile, knowing exactly what she meant. She was reminding me that the certificate number of this necklace can be traced back to Richard's shell company in the Cayman Islands. Her husband's private detective had already sent me the complete flowchart of funds last week. The way that bastard stuffed the company's money into his own pocket was as stupid as a 3-year-old stealing candy. When the dinner party broke up, Richard was too drunk to stand, and was thrown onto the living room sofa by 2 bodyguards, like a dead dog. "Clean this up," he muttered, barely able to open his eyes. "I need to see the quarterly report before the golf tournament tomorrow." "Yes, dear," I replied obediently, turning around and putting the wine glass he had just used into a sealed bag. His lip print was still on the rim of the glass. Sarah said it was best for DNA testing, which could be used as supplementary evidence of domestic violence in court. At 2 in the morning, the whole house was finally quiet. I sat in the study, with a pile of documents spread out in front of me, and 3 windows open on the computer screen. Richard's email, the password was what I guessed, his first girlfriend's birthday, stupid as can be, the flow of funds in our joint account, every expense made me angry, and the encrypted folder sent by Sarah, titled Carson Holdings, Evidence Chain of Tax Fraud. The New York outside the window was like a huge neon sign, dazzlingly bright. I took a sip of cold coffee, bitter as Chinese medicine. In the surveillance footage, Richard was sleeping like a pig, his snoring audible through the screen. He probably never imagined that the wife he scolded as a mathematical idiot was the best analyst at JP Chase for 3 consecutive years, and that I had already backed up his dog's hit criminal evidence on servers in 3 different countries, so even if he smashed this computer, it would be useless. The phone suddenly vibrated. It was a message from Sarah. "The IRS is ready, just waiting for you to send the signal. Is the trigger ready?" I turned my head and looked at the dressing table. The blue dress I was going to wear tomorrow was hanging there, Richard's favorite color, saying I looked docile and sensible in it. The dress pocket contained enough medicine to embarrass him in public, and a recording device was sewn inside the hem, fully charged. "Soon," I replied, just waiting for the perfect opportunity. Preferably in front of everyone, the more the better. Just like 3 years ago, when he announced my resignation at the company's annual meeting, in front of hundreds of people, saying that my wife will focus on taking care of the family and be my strongest support in the future. At that time, I stood beside him, smiling so hard my face was stiff, wishing I could splash the champagne in my hand on his face. This time, it's his turn. When Richard slapped me at Sunday brunch, his mother Madeline's most prized silver coffee spoon was still stuck in the French toast. Butter flowed down the bread seams, accumulating in a small puddle on the bone china plate, like a puddle of unclean tears. "For God's sake, Emily," his voice was very low, the anger in his chest was about to burst out, like those traders on Wall Street who were about to be liquidated. "You question my investment decisions in front of the whole family? What do you think you are?" The sunlight slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows and hit my left face, burning hot. I could taste the bloody taste of the inside of my lip being broken by my teeth, rusty, more pungent than the bourbon he drank last night. But what made me even more uncomfortable was the look in his sister Claire's eyes across the table. The Harvard Law School graduate who specializes in divorce cases was now scanning my red and swollen cheeks with the eyes of examining evidence, as if evaluating the chain of evidence in court. "Richard!" His mother Madeline screamed. Her southern accent was sickeningly sweet, like freshly melted syrup. "Look what you've done. This is the English bone china passed down from your grandmother." She stroked the teacup on the corner of the table with distress, as if the cup was 10 times more precious than my face. "She deserved it." Richard tugged at his tie, the Fendi one I gave him last Christmas, which had completely drained the quarterly clothing budget he'd approved for me. He turned to his dad. "Dad, you saw it too, right? Her attitude about the hedge fund thing. Women just don't understand risk management." Old Carson grunted, the steak knife in his hand scraping against the plate with a grating sound. For 12 years, that sound had meant my son is right. For 12 years, I'd been playing the doll they wanted at this mahogany dining table, smiling, keeping quiet, showing the appropriate adoring look when my husband bragged about his stock market victories, like a robot with an on-off switch. I touched my burning cheek, my finger pressing on the faint line his ring had left. It was funny, that wedding ring had been bought with my year-end bonus. Back when I was an analyst at JP Chase, I got a pretty good bonus at the end of the year, and he said, "It's more worthwhile for me to manage the money," and then he turned around and bought this thing to put on my hand, like putting a collar on a pet. "Excuse me, I'm going to touch up my makeup." I pushed back my chair, and as soon as I stood up, someone kicked my ankle. I looked down and Claire was slipping a tissue into my hand, and inside the tissue was a hard card, Sarah Chin Law Firm, specializing in marital asset recovery. Her nails were painted with nude nail polish, like she wasn't wearing any, meeting the Carson family's requirement for women to be discreet and proper. The mirror in the powder room reflected the carefully maintained facade I had, glowing skin nurtured by La Mer cream, YSL matte lip stain still firmly clinging to my lips, not even a smudge of mascara. What a perfect Upper East Side wife, forced to maintain elegance even after being hit, like a mannequin in a shop window. I turned on the faucet, cold water rushing over the bruise on the inside of my wrist, the one he'd pinched last night when he thought my massage wasn't strong enough. He was drunk at the time, muttering about how sensible Amber is, and I almost poured all the massage oil in my hand over his bald head. My phone vibrated in my Chanel jacket, buzzing. I pulled it out and saw that an encrypted file from Sarah was loading, titled Carson Family Trust Fund Abnormal Liquidity Records. The progress bar crawled slowly, like my life for the past 3 years, wearing me down. "Emily?" Richard's voice sounded from outside the door, with that condescending tenderness that gave me goosebumps. "Come on out, let's talk." I practiced smiling 3 times in the mirror until the muscles in my face formed a memory, able to pull off the perfect curve without even thinking. When I opened the door, he was holding a Bloody Mary, the lemon slice hanging crookedly on the celery stalk, like a little gallows. "Drink this," he said softly, without looking at me, "and then go change into that blue dress. The Prestons are coming for afternoon tea at 4. I took the glass, my fingernail quietly smearing along the rim. 3 hours ago, I'd ground 0.2 milligrams of lorazepam into powder and hid it under my manicure. I learned this trick from Amber, that little minx always liked to add good stuff to Richard's drinks. That dose was enough to make him sleepy and lose face in front of the guests this afternoon, but not so much as to arouse suspicion, just right. "Of course, darling." I sipped, watching his reflection twist and distort in the antique mirror across the room, like a monster in a funhouse mirror. During afternoon tea, Richard's eyelids began to droop, as if glued shut. The hand holding his teacup was shaking a little, and he almost spilled tea on the tablecloth several times, the tablecloth that Madeleine brought back from France, said to be an antique from the time of Louis XVI. "Darling, you look exhausted." I handed him a third macaron sprinkled with sleeping pill powder, my voice as sweet as honey. "Try this, Jacques made it, with your favorite almond powder." Mrs. Preston across from me twitched the corner of her mouth almost imperceptibly. She had just taught me this morning how to use natural vanilla extract to mask the bitter taste of the medicine, and said that her grandmother used this trick to deal with her cheating grandfather, and it always worked. Richard shook his head hard, his tie hanging crookedly around his neck, like an untied shoelace. This made him look like a plucked peacock, no longer able to strut proudly. It was really funny. "Mr. Carson is too invested in the merger," Mr. Preston said slowly, while pushing his phone onto the table. On the screen was Richard and Amber's check-in record at the Ritz-Carlton, the date being exactly the night last month when I was hospitalized for a migraine. At that time, he even pretended to come to the hospital to see me, holding white roses in his hand, as fake as the smell of disinfectant in my hospital room. Richard suddenly flinched, and the bone china teacup flipped over with a clang. Brown tea stains spread across his $30,000 Brioni suit, like an ugly venomous snake, crawling across his chest. His pupils began to dilate, and his right hand twitched unnaturally. This was a typical reaction to 0.5 milligrams of lorazepam. My friend in medical school had specifically looked up the information. "I'll get a towel." When I got up, I deliberately knocked over the sugar bowl, and the delicate sugar cubes rolled all over the floor, one of which stopped right next to Claire's feet. As she bent down to pick it up, she winked at me quickly. This former bystander of domestic violence was now my Trojan horse planted in the Carson family, and a Trojan horse that knew the law. In the powder room, I locked the door behind me and frantically dialed Sarah's number. "He drank it. The dose is enough to embarrass him at the board meeting. Are you ready on your end?" "Don't worry," Sarah's voice had the rustling sound of paper turning. "I just got the complete path of his asset transfer." "Guess where he hid the money?" "In the charitable foundation under your name. The bastard is cunning enough." In the mirror, my smile finally didn't need to be practiced, it came from the heart. Richard always said that I was his best investment, and now it seems that this investment is about to burst, and it's the kind that loses everything. When I returned to the living room, Richard was already snoring loudly on the sofa, drool almost reaching the Hermes cushion. The Prestons exchanged a look, and the meaning in that look couldn't be clearer. This play was approaching its climax. Claire had already pulled out her phone and taken several pictures of Richard's unsightly behavior, probably to keep as evidence. Let him sleep for a while. I gently covered my husband with a blanket, my fingers quickly searching his suit pocket. Mergers and acquisitions are too exhausting. The hotel room card with Amber's lipstick mark was now lying safely in my garter belt, like a ticking time bomb. Richard sleeping at the board meeting was even more spectacular than I imagined, simply the best comedy of the year. I stood outside the conference room on the 45th floor of the JP Morgan Chase Tower, looking inside through the glass wall. Richard was sitting in the main seat in a suit and tie, but his head was bobbing up and down, like a nodding toy in slow motion, like a drugged bulldog. His senior partner, Williams, was presenting the quarterly report, and the impatience in his voice was almost overflowing. The old man had long disliked Richard, thinking he was a lucky upstart. "Mr. Carson?" Williams knocked on the table. "The hedge fund loss in the third quarter." Richard's head jerked up, then fell heavily again, his forehead hitting the solid wood conference table with a dull thud that made me wince for him. The conference room fell silent instantly, so quiet that you could hear the hum of the central air conditioning. The directors looked at each other, their faces as if they had seen a ghost. I pushed the door open with a cup of coffee in my hand, my high heels clicking on the floor, like a countdown clock. "Sorry to interrupt," I smiled appropriately. I thought Richard might need this to perk him up. When the coffee cup was placed in front of him, Richard's turbid eyes barely focused. He reached for it, but his hand trembled so badly that the entire cup of coffee splashed all over his pants with a whoosh. The dark brown liquid spread on his expensive suit pants, right in the crotch area, making it look like he had wet himself. "Fuck." Richard stood up abruptly, the chair scraping harshly on the floor, like fingernails scratching a blackboard. The 12 men on the board stared at his crotch in unison. Some couldn't help but laugh, others quickly looked away, but no one dared to speak, at least not yet. "Honey," I handed him a stack of tissues, my voice not too loud or too soft, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "You've been working too hard lately, why don't you go home and rest?" Richard's expression was as if he had been punched in the chest. His mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water, unable to say a word for a long time. This was too unusual. The usual Richard could talk for 2 hours at a board meeting, rebutting every objection, like a rooster that had won a fight. Williams cleared his throat, breaking the awkward silence. "In view of Mr. Carson's physical condition, I suggest we adjourn the meeting." "No." Richard slammed the table, but almost fell because he used too much force. Fortunately, he grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. "I'm fine. Let's continue the meeting." Just then, the large screen in the conference room suddenly lit up. No one had touched the remote control, but the screen clearly showed Richard's bank statements, 3 large transactions transferred from our joint account, all to the same offshore account, the zeros after the numbers making people dizzy. "What the hell is this?" Richard's face turned white in an instant, like paper. I pretended to be alarmed and covered my mouth. "Oh my God, is it a hacker attack? Network security is such a problem these days." But in my heart, I was sneering, "This hacker is me." The director's expressions changed from confusion to shock, and then to anger. Numbers don't lie. Over the past 6 months, Richard had transferred nearly $2 million to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. And the best part was that the registration email for this account clearly showed amber.rose@carsoncapital.com. Richard suddenly turned his head and glared at me, his eyes almost spitting fire. "You. What about me, darling?" I blinked innocently. "I just came to bring you a cup of coffee." The conference room door opened again, and Claire walked in with 2 SEC investigators. She was wearing her most formal Armani suit today, her hair neatly pulled back, looking like a true Wall Street elite, not the Carson family's always overlooked little daughter. "Mr. Richard Carson," Claire's voice was as cold as ice, "the Securities and Exchange Commission has some questions to ask you. About insider trading and embezzlement." Richard's expression reminded me of when he spilled red wine at a Michelin restaurant on our first date, that mixture of shock, shame, and anger. But that time, he could still laugh it off. This time, no one would help him clean up the mess. I turned and left gracefully, my high heels tapping out a crisp rhythm on the marble floor, like a funeral march for him. Just before the elevator doors closed, I heard Richard's desperate roar. "Emily! You goddamn bitch!" But it was too late. As the elevator descended, I opened my phone and saw a message from Sarah. "IRS froze all his accounts. Amber is giving a statement at the police station. She thought the money was her severance pay. So stupid." I smiled and put my phone back in my bag. Today's board meeting was just an appetizer. The main course is yet to come, like tomorrow's headline in the Wall Street Journal, or next week's divorce court hearing. I want him to know how serious the consequences are of pissing off a woman who understands finance and holds grudges. The Wall Street Journal reporter arrived even earlier than the divorce lawyer. I sat in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new apartment, watching the news vans and flashing lights downstairs, like watching a circus performance. The newspaper headline was already drafted: "The Fall of the Wolf of Wall Street, the complete record of Richard Carson's alleged fraud case." The photo was chosen very dramatically, Richard being led out of the building by the SEC, his tie askew, with yesterday's coffee stains still on his pants, looking like a homeless man. My phone vibrated, a message from Sarah, just 2 words, "He signed." I stared at the screen and suddenly laughed out loud. 3 months ago, Richard sat at that mahogany dining table, full of himself, slamming his hand on the table and saying to me, "Emily, you won't get a penny from me. Divorce? You won't even take the doorknob of this house." And now? He not only agreed to split the assets equally but also paid an extra $2 million in emotional distress compensation, just to keep me from releasing the surveillance video of him assaulting me in the office to the media. I installed the camera in a hidden corner of the study while he was showering. The angle was so good you could see his ferocious expression clearly. The doorbell rang. Looking through the peephole, it was Claire, holding a bottle of Dom Perignon and 2 glasses. Today, she wasn't wearing her lawyer suit but simple jeans and a white t-shirt, looking 10 years younger, like a recent college graduate. Celebrating, she shook the champagne in her hand, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "We must celebrate." I stepped aside to let her in, closing the door behind her, blocking out the flashing lights and noise. We had barely poured the champagne when Richard's exclusive interview started playing on TV. He looked haggard, with huge bags under his eyes, like he was carrying 2 walnuts. His suit hung loosely on his body, he clearly hadn't been to the gym in days, and all those muscles had probably disappeared. "It's a misunderstanding," he said to the camera, his voice as hoarse as sandpaper rubbing wood. "My wife. I mean, ex-wife, she's always had mental problems, paranoia, delusions." Claire pressed the mute button. "Same old story, blame the woman when things go wrong." She pursed her lips and took a sip of champagne. "My dad used to say the same thing about my mom." "And what happened?" "My mom donated all the money he hid in the garage to a stray cat rescue." I took a sip of champagne. The feeling of the bubbles bursting on my tongue reminded me of that decisive night, when I laid all the evidence in front of Richard, the fear that flashed across his face, like a mouse seeing a cat. "You know what's the most ironic thing?" I walked to the desk, opened a folder, and pushed it in front of Claire. "He always thought I didn't understand anything, but these." Inside the folder were all the accounts I had secretly recorded over the past 3 years, the assets Richard had transferred, the fake invoices, even the villa he bought in the Bahamas, registered in his mother's name but using our marital property. Every transaction was recorded clearly, with bank statements and transfer records attached, more detailed than the company's financial statements. "He taught me one thing," I said softly, the corners of my mouth turning up slightly: never underestimate a woman who understands finance, especially one who's been pissed off. Claire turned to the last page, suddenly widened her eyes, and almost dropped her champagne glass. This is. I nodded, feeling a surge of satisfaction. It was Richard's father's dirty secret, 20-year-old tax fraud records, which I had asked Mrs. Plimpton's customs friend to investigate for 3 months to find, enough to keep old Carson in prison for the rest of his life. He made his fortune from this back then, and now it's time to pay it back. "I thought you just wanted freedom," Claire's voice trembled slightly, "but this is nuclear-level revenge." Outside the window, the sunset dyed the Manhattan skyline blood red, breathtakingly beautiful. I raised my glass and clinked it gently with Claire's, making a crisp sound. "No," I said, watching the bubbles in the glass slowly rise, "this is just the beginning." The scrolling news at the bottom of the TV screen was still updating. Carson Capital announces bankruptcy, multiple investors file class action lawsuit, Richard Carson suspended from all financial trading qualifications, FBI investigates Carson family money laundering case. One after another, like setting off firecrackers, making people feel comfortable. I turned off the TV and turned on the stereo. Soothing jazz flowed through the room, in stark contrast to the noise downstairs. This is the life I wanted, quiet, free, without having to look at anyone's face anymore. "Where to next?" Claire asked, her eyes full of anticipation. She had already come clean with her family, saying she would testify for me, and probably wouldn't be able to go back home after this. I smiled and took out 2 plane tickets from the drawer, handing one to her, the Bahamas. "I think it's time to go see my new villa, and change the registration name. That villa should have been mine in the first place." The phone rang again. It was Madeline. Her name was flashing on the screen, the old lady who always liked to use her syrupy southern accent to lecture me to know the rules. "Emily." Her voice was much older, without the usual imperiousness. "We need to talk about Richard." I walked to the balcony, the night breeze blowing through my hair, a little cool, but refreshing. The timid housewife from 3 years ago was dead, died on that rainy night when Richard first hit me. Standing here now is a woman whose soul is plated with steel. Of course, Madeline, I said softly, the politeness in my tone like a thin layer of ice. Have your lawyer contact my lawyer. Sarah Chin, she's very professional. Hanging up the phone, I took one last look at the New York night scene. The lights were bright, just like when I first moved here 3 years ago, only this time, those lights no longer dazzled me. This time tomorrow, I will be lying on the beach in the Bahamas, drinking piña coladas with rum, watching Richard get ruined in the news. The sound of the waves will drown out his roar, and the sun will dry up all the bruises on my body, including the invisible ones. The best part of revenge? It's not watching him fall so hard, nor the thrill of getting that compensation. It's every day for the rest of my life that I don't have to pretend to smile. It's waking up in the morning without having to think about what color dress to wear to please him. It's not having to worry about what I say at dinner that will make him angry. It's being able to sleep soundly at night without locking the door. Claire came over and handed me a new glass of champagne. What are you thinking about? I looked at the faint light of the Statue of Liberty in the distance and smiled. I'm thinking, tomorrow's sunrise must be beautiful. My phone buzzed. It was a photo from Sarah, Richard in a prison uniform, standing in front of the detention center registration desk, his hair a mess, the arrogance on his face completely gone. The caption read, "Bail denied." The judge was really pissed after watching the domestic violence video. I deleted the photo. No need to keep it. This person, and the days he represents, should be completely wiped out. Let's go, I said, picking up my suitcase. To the airport. As the elevator descended, I looked at myself in the mirror. No elaborate makeup, no expensive suit, just a simple white t-shirt and jeans. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt like the person in the mirror was the real Emily. As the plane took off, the lights of New York slowly shrank beneath me, like an overturned jewelry box. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. Goodbye, Mrs. Carson. Hello, Emily.